All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of D&D Deep Dive, the show where we dived deep into classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today, we are going to do something slightly different. In the final 5th edition D&D Cross Final Fantasy XIV Classes and Races Compendium, most of the classes from Final Fantasy XIV have their own unique class, and then they have all these subclasses. That's what I've been doing thus far. But someone mentioned actually in the Reddit, which if you didn't know, if you haven't downloaded this supplement yourself, if you go into the description, there's a thing that says get it here. And if you click on that, it takes you directly to the Reddit. The pinned post there actually has all the versions of it, so you can download whatever version you want. Generally, you want the most up-to-date, but maybe they introduced something that you didn't really like, you liked the previous version, they have them all there. So, I post all these videos there too, and I get comments there too. And somebody said, well, why don't you do some of the classes that are actually subclasses in 5th edition? And I thought, hey, that might be fun. And it's slightly easier on me, simply because I don't have to figure out what the defining features of a brand new class are. I already know the defining features of these classes. I just have to figure out how the subclass interacts with it. So that's what I'm going to be starting today. Very quickly, as a reminder, in the if you are enjoying this, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon, turn notifications on. All of those help immensely. So that being said, of the of the many classes that are in here, there's an exact number, and I can't think of it right now because my brain isn't working. But there are actually 4. That the classes themselves already exist in the D&D. That is the Paladin, the Monk, the Rogue, and the Bard. Now, the interesting thing about the Rogue is, for all the rest of these, this is the quote-unquote what's called the class name. In A Realm Reborn, the first version of Final Fantasy XIV after the one that doesn't exist anymore, that we don't speak of. In A Realm Reborn, when you, and even now, when you start a new character in Final Fantasy XIV, you will pick their job, which all of the jobs at level 30 kind of evolve into a class. Or maybe it's different. Maybe it's a class in the beginning and then it's a job. I can't remember what the terms are, but Rogue, you actually can't start as a rogue, but as soon as you hit level 15, you can switch to a rogue, and then level 1 to 30 is a rogue, and then from 30 to bajillion, you're a ninja. So the rogue subclass in this is the ninja. However, we are going to start alphabetically, because that made the most sense to me in my addled brain. So today, we are going to be talking about the Bard archetype of the College of the Skysinger. Now, first things first, this is going to be a little bit unique for me because I haven't played a bard in Final Fantasy XIV. I have played a bard in 5th edition. I made a super cool spy bard who is not so much about being flirty and sleeping with everything. He was literally like a Michael Weston style spy. That would go out and was very good at imitating things and forging documents and things like he was a spy, and I really liked it. But I've not actually played the Bard in Final Fantasy XIV. Now, I have played an Archer, which is the starting job, I think. This starting starter job thing for the Bard. And that's one of the things that's kind of unique about the Bard specifically in Final Fantasy XIV is the Bard is a job that has existed in Final Fantasy since I believe Bard first showed up either in Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy III. I think it might have started in Final Fantasy III. But it definitely was in Final Fantasy IV with Edward, I believe. And basically, the bard, their weapon that they used was a harp. And the thing that was interesting about bards in Final Fantasy is generally offensively they were kind of bubkiss. Your harps in most Final Fantasy games that have a bard job, your harps were not super powerful. You could get elemental harps and things like that, and if you could, use elemental weaknesses and the things like that, or sometimes some harps would have status effects that would happen if you attacked somebody with it. But for the most part, bards were not that useful as far as doing damage or anything like that. What they did have were these things called songs, which were generally either party-wide buffs or they were like enemy side wide debuffs of some sort. And they were really interesting. Generally, what would happen is your bard would spend time playing this song, and it would have some sort of effect on the party that was beneficial. But while the bard was playing, which generally would take a number of turns, you couldn't actually use them to do anything else. And so these kind of buff songs were, in order to kind of justify having a bard in the party, the buff songs had to be relatively decent. Now, not a ton of people used bards. Like Final Fantasy V is the one that I'm most familiar with. I know Final Fantasy IV pretty well, and everybody hated Edwards so much. But they had a bard job in Final Fantasy V, and they were useful for a very small period of time in the game. When you first got them to when you got the next crystal and got your last grouping of jobs, you could actually have some fun with the bards. They had some abilities you could learn by leveling the bard up that were kind of interesting. But for the most part, they lose effectiveness pretty quickly. So moving on to Final Fantasy XIV, the way that it was originally built is you would have these jobs, and then to get to these soul crystal, so maybe they were classes at first and then they turned into jobs later. Anyway, to get to the upgraded version, originally what you had to do is you actually had to have multiple base jobs leveled up to 15 to get to an advanced job like Paladin or Black Mage or Summoner or something along those lines. And you could actually use some of the abilities of multiple base jobs as this advanced job. And it was a really interesting mechanic, but it didn't really work super duper well because as much as it seemed like it gave people a lot of freedom to create these really interesting builds, it didn't. There was only one viable build generally of any class. And so they kind of reverted it to a more traditional, class-based system where you would start with a base class like a Lancer, turns into a Dragoon, or I think it's a Marauder. I might be wrong about this. A Marauder turns into a Paladin, or a Pugilist turns into a Monk, and that's how it works. Well, with the Bard is really weird because it upgrades from an Archer whose weapon is a bow. And when you make these upgrades, they keep the same weapon. So the Bard in Final Fantasy XIV doesn't use a harp. They use a bow because it kind of looks like a harp. And a lot of them can play their bows like they are harps. But it makes for kind of an interesting class in general. And the other thing that's interesting about bards is playing them. Bards are a very RNG dependent class. For anyone that doesn't know what RNG is, RNG stands for Random Number Generator. And it's a remarkably complex thing that was developed basically to simulate this. This is a very simple random number generator because when I roll, it has, if it is built correctly, it has a 5% chance of landing on any one of these numbers. Now, computer programs have been created to create and be able to select random numbers, and these are called random number generators. But in order for a computer to actually come to a truly random number, it is remarkably complicated. Like the amount of math and coding that goes into creating fair RNG is remarkably complex. So when I say RNG, I mean random number generator. That's just something that in MMOs in particular, RNG is just, you know, the luck of the die effectively. So the Bard in Final Fantasy 14 is very much limited to or is tied to randomness, because their main class feature in Final Fantasy 14 is this these songs and these repertoires. Basically, you can choose to use an ability that starts a song playing, which is basically a party-wide buff. And what happens is, as long as that song is playing, your party will receive like increased damage or an increased crit chance or something like that. Then, while it's playing, the Bard is also uses a lot of damage over to time abilities. And so whenever one of these damage over time abilities procs, which basically means they do their damage, anytime they tick, they do their damage, you might get what's called a proc, which basically means randomly when one of those ticks happens where the enemy takes damage, it might give you what's called a repertoire. And a repertoire can count up, I believe the top number is 4. But what happens is you gain these repertoires randomly. There's, I think it's like a 40% chance on any tick of a damage over time, you'll get a repertoire. And as you gain these repertoires, the more you will have an ability you use that uses those repertoires, and it'll generally require 1 repertoire. And then if you have more than 1, it does more damage generally. And that's how the Bard is built. Is it's very much dependent on randomness. So if we look at the Bard in D&D, that is nothing like what the Bard is in D&D. Quick refresher on 5th edition class design. Every class is designed to have to play very, very differently right from the beginning. In order to do this, they have these things that we call defining features. These defining features are things either unique to the class or things that the class gets before everyone else. And in order to be a defining feature, they have to show up in the first 2 levels. So what makes the Bard in D&D special? Well, 2 things. One, it has inspiration. Inspiration is the main Bard thing. It's what makes them really special. They get it right at 1. And basically, inspiration, you have a number of inspiration die. And as a bonus action, you can inspire one of your allies. And effectively what it does is you give them one of these dice, and they get to use that dice on their next, I believe it's ability check or saving throw. You might be able to use it on attack rolls too. I have it right in front of me. Let's look. A creature can roll the die and add the number they rolled to one ability check, attack roll, or saving throw it makes. So yeah, basically it gives them a die bonus to an ability check, saving throw, and attack roll. And it's a really cool mechanic because by using your inspiration effectively, you can ensure that the people that really need their things to hit are going to hit. So it might be that you give it to the wizard because they're concentrating on a banish spell right now. And if the banishment spell ends, you're going to double the number of enemies on the battlefield, and we can't have that. So you give an inspiration die to them, so when they have to make their concentration checks, they can add their inspiration. They can be OKKK and not have to worry about doubling the number of enemies on the field. Things like that. It's a really fun mechanic. And most of the subclasses give the Bard new ways to use these inspiration to the dice. The other defining feature of the Bard, they get at level 2, it's called Jack of all trades. Basically any ability or any skill that they are not proficient in, they can add half their proficiency bonus. So even untrained skills, they will do better than your average person. And so they can be that very fun character that goes in and really can kind of fit themselves in anywhere. They're not going to be the absolute best at everything. but they're going to do better on average than really any other character on the table, because they just, no matter what they do, they're going to have something to add to it in general. So that is the D&D Bard. Whether, marrying this very RNG dependent, damage over time, which doesn't exist really in 5th edition, and song-based class to the D&D version of the Bard, which is much more about kind of hedging your bets and being able to manipulate RNG by adding additional dice and modifiers to things. We'll see. So, that was a really, really long intro for something that I think might be pretty short. So starting at 3rd level, first thing you get for the College of the Skysinger is bonus proficiencies. You gain proficiency with longbows, the history skill, and one other skill of your choice, which makes sense. Again, bards in Final Fantasy XIV are bow users. So the fact that bards can't use bows, they can use crossbows, but it's not the same. That you would need the proficiency in that. And it's actually not uncommon for bards to have a pretty decent dex score as well, because they're charisma-based spellcasters. They are full spellcasters, but they're charisma-based spellcasters, and a lot of bard subclasses kind of flirt with the kind of martial and magic melding. So a lot of bards have a decent dexterity score for making attacks. So makes perfect sense. History, again, it kind of makes sense with the idea the bard just gets a lot of skill proficiencies. They already get more than every other class. I don't really see how history really fits in much with the lore of bards in Final Fantasy XIV, beyond the fact that bards are effectively the historians in Final Fantasy XIV. They are the people that kind of tell the history through songs and epic poems and the things like that. So, yeah, and then another skill of your choice. I don't really understand where that's coming from. Again, the history, okay. Bards are the storytellers and the history keepers in Final Fantasy XIV. Makes sense. And the bows have to be. Giving them another skill, it just seems weird to me, especially since this isn't the only 3rd level ability they get. So yeah, that's just one thing where I'm like, you know what? You probably don't need that. Bards already have quite a few skills. Giving them just another one for free after they're already getting one plus a brand new weapon, they're probably not going to use it that much. Going on to the other 3rd level ability, which is Troubadour's Paean, I think is how you pronounce that. This is a weird spelling. Paean. So I think that's Paean. But I've never actually seen that word, so. A creature that has a bardic inspiration die from you can roll that die to gain temporary hit points equal to the result when an attack or spell targets the creature. While those temporary hit points are protecting the creature, they gain advantage against intelligence, wisdom, and charisma-based saving throws. So, first things first, this does what most other bard subclasses do, which is gives you a different way to use bardic inspiration, which in this particular case is to give them a shield. The issue with that being is it doesn't say if this is a reaction or anything like that. It just says that, well, whenever it happens, they can do that, which would kind of fit in with how bardic inspiration dice work. But the wording is just a little bit weak. To make it a little bit clearer, you generally want to start with the condition that allows you to use it. So they should technically flip the sentence around so that when an attack or spell targets the creature, or when an attack or spell targets a creature that has a bardic inspiration dice, they can roll that die to gain temporary hit points equal to the result. While those temporary hit points are protecting the creature, they gain advantage against intelligence, wisdom, and charisma-based saving throws. Now, this is something that's weird, because if a spell targets them, in general, it's going to do damage, especially if an attack targets them. It's going to do damage And the biggest bard die you can get is not going to completely ignore an attack. It's going to cushion it for the most part. So effectively, while those temporary hit points are protecting the creature, really is for the roll that you're using this on, you can have advantage if it's intelligence, wisdom, or charisma based, which is really complicated for such a simple ability. One of the things 5th edition did, and one of the reasons it's as popular as it is now, is it took away a lot of the rules for rules' sake. Things like an example I use all the time when I'm talking about like 3rd edition, which was just needlessly complicated, to 5th edition, was dual wielding. In 3rd edition, dual wielding is a massively complicated thing. The way dual wielding works in the 3rd edition is if you are wielding a weapon if you are wielding 2 weapons, you are going to get a penalty to your attack rolls, depending on which weapon you're using. Your main hand, you're going to get a minus... I want to say it's a -2 on your main hand attacks. So even if you don't use that, if you're just holding a second weapon in your other hand, you get a -2 to your main hand and -6 to your offhand attacks. Now, there's a bunch of feats that will change that. You can take the dual wielding feat, or 2-weapon fighting feat. Sorry, the 2-weapon fighting feat. And what that does is it reduces the main hand penalty by 2 and the offhand penalty by 2. So now it's a 0 penalty to your main hand and a -4 to your offhand. Now you can take improved dual wielding, which removes the penalty on the offhand by another 2. So now it's 0 here and it's a -2 on here. Then you could take ambidexterity, which reduces the offhand penalty completely, because now you're just both there. And so you have to take 3 feats to get to the point where you actually have a positive attack roll on your second attack. And it's massively confusing. Dual wielding in 5th edition is very simple. In order to use 2-weapon fighting, what you do is when you make an attack action, if you are already holding a light weapon in your offhand, and the weapon in your main hand is a light weapon, you can make an attack as a bonus action, and that attack doesn't add your ability modifier to the damage. That's it. So as long as you're wielding 2 light weapons, you use the attack action, you can make another attack using the same numbers. It's super simple. It's just to make sure the weapons are light. That's it. There's a feat you can get later on that makes it so you don't have to have them be light weapons, and there's a fighting style you can get that eventually lets you add the damage to the other attack. So it's pretty simple compared to the 5th edition with all the extra, or the 3rd edition with all the extra numbers. So that's what 5th edition is built around, is this idea of we want to make things as simple as possible. Adding complexity doesn't actually make it better unless the complexity somehow gives the ability to do something that you can't do without the complexity. Having different schools of magic is complexity. They could all just be magic, or you could have divine spells, arcane spells, nature spells. You don't have to separate them into all these different schools of magic. However, by giving different schools of magic, that allows you to be able to focus certain abilities by affecting certain schools of magic. So that complexity does add complexity, but that complexity allows for something new. This adds complexity to using the inspiration die. Generally, the inspiration die is, can I use it? Yes, no. Okay, I roll it. I add the number. This is, can I use it? Yes, no. Okay. Now I get to roll it, and now I have temporary hit points, which I have to take off of whatever attack is going to hit me. Plus, I may have advantage on this saving throw, but it has to be a certain kind of saving throw. And it's really not adding a huge benefit for the amount of complexity it's adding. You now have a new thing you have to track. You have to track your temporary hit points because theoretically, you might be being targeted by a spell that doesn't do damage. So using this would be a very useful thing then. Then you also have to go, okay, do I have advantage or do I not have advantage based on the saving throw that you're being forced to make. So it doesn't really add that much benefit to where, well, you can use it against a saving throw. But and this also effectively means you can't use it on the saving throw. Like, without Troubadour's Paean, you can get advantage on the saving throw, which mechanically, they've actually done the numbers. Mechanically, getting advantage on a roll is effectively adding a plus 3.5 modifier. From a statistics standpoint, you will roll generally about 3.5 points higher if you have advantage than if you don't have advantage. The Bardic Inspiration die starts at a D6. So already trading the die for advantage is a net loss for you because a third of the time you're going to be rolling higher than advantage is giving you. Now, when you get up to a D8, half the time you're doing it. A D10, it's even worse. So the higher your level, the less advantageous it is to have advantage over being able to just add your proficiency die. And again, the temporary hit points are generally only going to be useful for cushioning the blow, not really for doing much else. And again, there are so many other things you can use that Bardic Inspiration die that Troubadour's Paean just doesn't really seem to give you a benefit, especially since it's really complicated for a third level of ability. And I know I tend to harp on this complication a lot, but it's because a very, very common thing for a lot of new designers is, well, if I just add more and more things to this, I add more and more systems, it's going to make it that much cooler because it's more customizable. And it's not. It turns people away and it turns people off really, really quickly. It's one of the reasons why 3rd edition, and I heard this argument before, and they said people say 3rd edition was bad, but no, 3rd edition was the most popular RPG on the market at the time. Yeah, at the time when no one was playing it. RPGs were not a mainstream thing until 5th edition. And the reason I know that is because when Hasbro bought Wizards of the Coast, they bought Wizards of the Coast for magic. They didn't care about Dungeons and Dragons. It just came along, unfortunately. The first time Dungeons and Dragons was mentioned on a P&L report for Hasbro, who owns all these things, was a massive deal. So yes, 3rd edition was the most popular RPG at the time, but it's kind of like, being the, oh God, my brain is just gone. It's kind of like being the most popular die in your 7 die set. Well, yeah, my D20 is the most popular die. It's number 1 of 7. That's it. There's not much competition there. And yes, there was a lot more competition than the dice for the 3rd edition. It really was not that popular outside of RPG circles, which were not very large. Now, the problem with 3rd edition is, while yes, it was the most popular of its time, it became very unpopular very quickly, and it stopped new players from coming in. Dungeons and Dragons had been seeing massive growth all the way through 1st edition, all through 2nd edition, and all the way through part of 3rd edition. And then the rules bloat came in, and it plateaued and plummeted. It is still one of the more popular versions of D&D. It outclasses both AD&D 1 and 2, original D&D, and 4th edition, though 4th edition is surprisingly close. But 5th edition blows it out of the water so far. And it was because it was so complicated that people stopped playing. There are a lot of people that are playing 5th edition now that stopped playing either just before 3rd edition or during 3rd edition because it was just too complicated. And that's why I harp so much when I start seeing things that just add complexity, because it goes against the core design philosophy of 5th edition, which was any complexity that is in there is necessary for the game to be better. We don't add complexity for complexity's sake. So yeah, overall, not a huge fan of Troubadour's plan, and our Paean, and from a purely numerical setting, it's inferior to just being able to add for everything except the temporary hit points. Sometimes it is real nice to have temporary hit points, but even at low levels, those temporary hit points are going to cushion a single blow. Whereas being able to make your deck save is going to save you a lot more hit points than getting 6 temporary hit points. So, yeah. Yeah. Let's go through the rest of this, and we might come back to see if there's a way that can be kind of modified to make it at least a little bit more useful. So, yeah. At 6th level, you get Scars of History. You get advantage on checks regarding the history of battles and tragedies, which is a role-playing thing. And I think it's cool. Again, if we really lean into that idea of bards are kind of the historians of the time, then yeah, that's kind of really interesting, and you can have a lot of fun being able to go, oh yes, I know about this battle, and blah 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 blah. And there's a lot of things you can do. I mean, how many times do you hear in random conversations here people will bring up little bits of history just to go, oh, here's a little point I'd like to make. So that's kind of cool. Now to the rest of the ability. When you cast a spell, you may expend a Bardic Inspiration die to cause a creature to strike with hesitation. Select a creature within 60 feet of you that can hear you. That creature must make a Charisma saving throw against your spell save DC. On a failed save, the creature's mind is wrought with sorrow, causing it to hold back until your next turn. When the creature makes a damage roll, their damage is reduced by an amount equal to the Bardic Inspiration die plus your Charisma ability modifier. The creature becomes immune to this effect for 1 hour afterwards. If successful, they are unaffected by your performance and become immune to the effect for 1 hour. So, effectively, when you cast a spell, which is unique, because thus far using a Bardic Inspiration die as a bard, use your bonus action to do it. This effectively allows you to use your Bardic Inspiration die as part of your spell casting action, because this happens when you cast a spell. So, this does change it from a bonus action ability to something that piggybacks on their spell casting, which again, bards are full spellcasters, so they have a lot of spells that they can cast, meaning they can use their Bardic Inspiration significantly more, which is cool. Now, Bardic Inspiration are renewed after a long rest. So the fact that they don't get a ton of Bardic Inspiration, it's tied to their Charisma modifier, so they only get a maximum of 5 per day. So in order to use one of these things, you can only use 5 times per day. It has to be something that's really useful. This isn't really. When a creature makes a damage roll, their damage is reduced by an amount equal to the Bardic Inspiration die plus your Charisma ability modifier. So again, this is a very complicated process because first of all, you have to cast a spell. Then you have to use your Bardic Inspiration die and choose a creature within 60 feet. That creature now has to make a Charisma saving throw, which is different from the saving throw they might be being made to make your spell. Or it might be a completely different creature. It doesn't say you actually have to select the same creature you cast this as a spell on. Or even that it has to be the same kind of creature. Like you might cast a healing spell and then use Scars of History on an enemy. So they have to make a save. On a failed save, now every damage roll they make until your next turn, they have to subtract damage from. which could be really useful if they are a creature that uses something like multi-attack. That could stack up and be very useful. Or could be completely worthless because they could just do something that doesn't require a damage roll. And then they're immune to that ability for the rest of the fight. To be perfectly honest, they're immune to that ability for the rest of existence. Because in general, if you are using something like this and they're causing damage against you, they're generally going to be dead by the end of the fight, or you are going to be dead by the end of the fight. So this is kind of a very strange one and done ability that's not technically one and done, because you can one and done it on multiple creatures. But as far as a single creature, this is a one and done ability. And again, when you look numbers wise, if it is a creature that's using multi-attack, that might be really useful, because if it's got 3 or 4 attacks, which at 6th level you're generally only going to have maybe 2 or 3. But let's say, it's got 3 attacks. That would be 3 inspiration die, which at 6th level I believe is going to be a D8. Yeah, it's a D8. So that's 3d8s plus your charisma modifier, which by 6th level is probably going to be at least an 18. So 3d8 plus 12 damage reduced. That's a pretty nice chunk of the damage off. However, for a single attack roll, that's 1d8 plus 4. That's not a lot. And it only happens once. Once, and you can never use it again, or you can't use it again for the rest of that fight. And for an hour, which again doesn't really matter, because again, most monsters you don't fight multiple times. There are very, very few cases where you're ever going to face the same creature again. So anything that lasts longer than a minute, which is 10 rounds of combat, doesn't matter. It could be 1 minute, it could be 2 years. It's going to be the same effect if you can't use it on again for as long as they exist. So it adds extra complexity by requiring an additional saving throw and then having to keep track of the Bardic Inspiration die for, subtracting the damage, and then having to remember that can't be used on that person again. And it doesn't give a huge benefit. Again, being able to use the Bardic Inspiration die on an ally to reduce, to have them make their save instead of fail it, is generally going to give you a larger amount of damage reduction. It's interesting, but again, your normal Bardic Inspiration is generally going to be a better bet than using Scars of History. The only advantage is you can use this without using your bonus action. Or even cast a spell as a bonus action, use Scars of History, and then use your action to fire that bow that you have now. So yeah, it's interesting, but again, it adds complexity without really giving a benefit. Finally, at 14th level, you get Wanderer's Ballad. When you cast a spell, you may expend 1 Bardic Inspiration die to further inspire your allies. Select an allied creature within 60 feet of you that can hear you. Their critical hit range increases by 1 for a number of rounds equal to your Charisma ability modifier. 5. Just say 5. By 14th level, it's 5. Charisma is their spellcasting ability. They're a spellcasting class. It's 5. The critical hit range increases by 1 for 5 rounds. If the creature is under another effect, which increases their crit range prior to the effect of Wanderer's Ballad, simply add the next lowest number to your crit range. For example, a fighter with a crit range of 19 or 20 affected by this ability has a crit range of 18, 19, or 20. So another one that is really complicated, but for, I guess, a decent thing. It increases your chance to critically hit by 5%. Which is nice, don't get me wrong. Again, this is another one that happens when you cast a spell. So that's cool. To be perfectly honest, if the kind of defining aspect of this subclass was you can now use Bardic Inspiration die when you cast a spell, I think that would be kind of cooler than the Troubadour's Paean. Just because, again, it changes how you use a defining feature of the class. It would be kind of cool. There would need to be some balancing aspects in there. But overall, I think that would be a much more interesting thing. And that's effectively what Scars of History and Wonders Ballad has done, is it allows you to use your Bardic Inspiration when you cast a spell in very specific ways. That being said, an increased critical hit range is nice. And having it be able to stack with maybe like the Dragoon's ability we talked about in the Dragoon's video, you know, being able to increase crit range even more can be very, very, very useful. But there are so few abilities that increase crit range. Like, quite literally, there is Champion Fighter has increased crit range. That's one of the defining things of the Champion Fighter, is they just get increased crit range. They're a very simple class to play because they don't really add a lot of mechanics. They just make things easier to do. And then that Dragoon ability. And I don't really think there may be more. If there's more, put them in the comments down below, because I simply cannot think of them right now. But it's a really limited thing. So giving this subclass the ability to expand crit is a cool thing. Again, is it useful enough that it's better than being able to make your save or make your attack roll when you need it, or make the skill check that you really need? With the fact that it's going to last for 5 turns, I'd say yeah, especially if you put it on the right character. You know, put it on a rogue or a barbarian where they already have things that get massively better when they crit, or a paladin, and it could be. And I like the idea of it. The complexity that it adds, which is basically your crit range is expanded and it adds on to other crit range expansions. That's a little bit of complexity. But the result, it lasts for 5 turns, and it's actually a useful thing, kind of justifies having to keep track of an additional thing. So I like that. And again, using it at the right time, it could be more useful in certain situations than just your general Bardic Inspiration, which is what you want. Good class design gives you choices. Bad class design gives you right answers. So this does give you choices. Are there going to be situations where it's just more beneficial for them to make their save instead of get a crit? Yes. Are there going to be situations where it's much more beneficial for them to get a crit than it is for them to make their saving throw? Yes. So the fact that these situations are going to really be up to the judgment of the person playing the bard, I like that. I think it's interesting. So final thoughts. Overall, again, I have not played a bard in Final Fantasy XIV. I have only played the archer up to, I think, around level 15. Which isn't saying much. Like, you have such a limited version of their kit. Like, I had 1 damage over time ability at by level 15, I believe. So it really is not enough for me to really understand the bard. But from watching a few videos about how to play the bard and reading through the mechanics and everything like that, this archetype does not feel like a Final Fantasy XIV bard. Now, the deck was already stacked against because the D&D bard is very, very different from the Final Fantasy XIV bard. But one of the kind of defining features of the Final Fantasy XIV bard that I knew even before getting into watching the videos and everything like that is the reliance on RNG. Praying to RNGesus is a thing for bards. And even I know that, and I don't play it. That is just one of the jokes that goes around Final Fantasy XIV. So I would have much rather seen something tied to randomness rather than these fairly complex ideas that generally don't really add a significant benefit. I mean, so bonus proficiencies makes perfect sense. You know, keep them. I was a little unsure about why they needed another random skill, because bards already get a lot of proficiencies and all these other things. So that's the only thing I was changing. Get rid of the other random skill, because you're already getting another thing at level 3. Troubadour's Paean doesn't make sense. It is never going to be beneficial to use Troubadour's Paean over just a normal bardic inspiration, unless you have something really important to do with your bonus action. And generally, bards don't. There's not a ton of spells that are bonus action casts. And bards are designed to use their bonus action for their bardic inspiration. So there's just not a ton. I mean, 2-weapon fighting maybe, but this one is supposed to be using a bow. So you can't 2-weapon fight with a longbow. So yeah, as far as a suggestion as to what it can do, I would love to see all of these add something, I guess, kind of akin to the Astrologian, where rolling an even number has one effect and rolling an odd number has a different effect. Just to kind of harken back to that dependence on randomness. It could be tied directly to the inspiration die. If you roll an odd number on your bardic inspiration die, one thing happens, you roll an even number another. So for Troubadour's Paean, you could, when you roll the bardic inspiration die on an attack roll, saving throw, or attack roll, saving throw, or ability check. Wow, that was much harder than it needed to be. When you roll it, if you roll an odd one, you can gain temporary hit points equal to the result. If you roll an even number, you can get advantage on your next saving throw in addition to what it normally does. So this would be adding on to what the bardic inspiration does, instead of just trying to replace it with something that just isn't as useful. So literally just changing it from you get both temporary hit points and advantage on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Change that to odd number, you get temporary hit points. Even number, you gain advantage on your next intelligence, wisdom, or charisma based saving throw within 10 minutes, because that's how long your bardic inspiration dice will last. So that, again, it goes back to that idea of the random RNG nature that is built into the bard, and gives you doesn't make you have to choose between using bardic inspiration and using Troubadour's Paean. Troubadour's Paean just enhances your bardic inspiration to do something kind of interesting. So yeah. And then again, the randomness, it may be that you can't use the temporary hit points, or you may not get an intelligence, wisdom, or in charisma based as a saving throw before it runs out. But that's just that, RNG stuff. So it's not super overpowered or anything like that. There are going to be situations where it's more useful. There's going to be situations where it doesn't affect anything else. But yeah, so I'd much rather see that. For Scars of History, again, I would much rather see Scars of History give you the advantage on checks regarding history of battles and tragedies. Okay? And then with Scars of History, I would almost say I don't know, because making you be able to use any bardic inspiration whenever you cast a spell does kind of break the class a little bit. So to be perfectly honest, I don't know what to do with Scars of History. It needs something different, because there's too much complexity for the benefit that it gives, and the benefit that it gives is really not worth it almost ever. It's a one and done ability with multiple charges, which is a really weird kick combo. So yeah, that I simply can't come up with a good idea for what it could change. I like the idea of giving you a way to burn a bardic inspiration when you cast a spell. It's just the effect that they have here doesn't make sense. Yeah, and then Wanderer's Ballad is really cool. I like it. Yeah. So yeah, overall, Scars of History needs work, and Troubadour's Paean. I would much rather see that again, make that modification. But other than that, it's an okay subclass. If we could turn Scars of History into something really interesting, I would say this would be a really fun class subclass to play. As it is right now, it's not. Two of the things as written are useless, and the final ability is cool, but comes so late that almost no one will ever get a chance to use it. So the best part of this class doesn't get used for most of the game. So, yeah. In the comments down below, let me know if you can come up with something interesting for Scars of History. Again, the idea is any complexity that you add needs to be necessary to add, to allow you to do something you could not do without that complexity. If it is just adding more complexity for complexity's sake, it's not going to be good. And it goes against 5th edition class design. So adding additional saving to the throws, and then more things you have to keep track of, unless there is no other way you can do this without having to make the creature roll possibly a second saving throw for the same ability trigger. Unless that is the absolute only way to give you other options, come up with a different way to do it. But let me know your guys' ideas in the comments down below. I'm interested to see if you guys can see something I can't. Otherwise, that is all for me today. As always, again, please remember, like, subscribe, turn notifications on. Have yourself a wonderful day, and I will see you guys next time, all right? Bye-bye.